Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed. Guys, Brian was so bad that we had to replace him with the great Sam Wan this week.
Yay!
Man, we're so excited that Sam is joining us. Barry is on sabbatical right now. You'll probably hear from him next week as we have another mailbag episode. Thanks for everybody who's been subscribing to the podcast, sharing the podcast, leaving comments and reviews. I checked our iTunes reviews the other day. We have all 5 stars so far. So
nice.
So far. So if you don't have 5 stars, just don't leave a review. But no, thank you so much for supporting the show. As I said earlier at the beginning, Sam is joining us. Sam Wan is the Director of Ministry Formation at DTS. He has, I think we had to bring out multiple hands for his doctorate degrees here.
That's right.
He has a doctorate in pharmacy from Michigan. Go Wolverines. Yes. You have a THM and PhD from DTS. I think all of this combined is like older than I am. You've been in ministry roles as a missionary and pastoral roles in Michigan, here in Texas, spent time a handful of years in Russia. But most of all, he's the biggest Dallas Mavericks fan. And I just wanted to say that for last because that's the best. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Hey, I'm really happy to be
so
here.
good to have
Thanks
you here.
for bringing me on. I feel a little pressure now because if y'all don't get like 5 stars, we all know why.
It's your fault, Sam.
Pretty clear where the...
It's not going to be your fault.
Oh, man. So, no, but this is really cool. Thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Can I follow you around and just list off your intro wherever you go?
It'll take 10 minutes.
Oh, my gosh. I don't have a budget for a hype man, but I'll have to talk to Hannah because I'd always wanted one. Yeah,
That's right.
Ever since my hip-hop days. That would be actually
The hip-hop
pretty
days.
cool.
Sissy, do you have hip-hop days?
Of course I have hip-hop days. Come on.
So today is going to be about hip-hop. And we're going to...
Totally new podcast episode.
Well, we really could do a whole episode on the intersection of Asian American youth and hip hop
Yeah.
culture. It really is a thing.
I feel like I almost need to
Write
add
that down. Write
Yeah,
that
I need to add a bullet point
real
for
thing.
today.
But anyway, sidetracked.
Well, no, Sam, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and spending some time with us. Today, we're going to talk about Asian American Pacific Islander Month. And I have a couple. I feel like I'm Brian Eck right now. Five facts to know about AAPI Heritage Month history. Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month was originally a week, which I didn't know that. It was President Jimmy Carter who signed it into law in 1978, designated a week to celebrate the AAPI community. It was in 1990 that President George W. Bush, or H.W. Bush, signed a bill that extended a week into a full month, and then President Obama changed the name to Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month back in 2009. It says, according to the 2020 census, there are 24 million people in the United States who fall under the umbrella of AAPI. And Pew Research Center has found that Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group in America. For reference, if somebody's listening to this and they don't know which ethnic groups fall into AAPI, could one of you explain that?
Sure. I think it's really worth a little bit of a discussion because AAPI is a huge umbrella. And that term or that it's really a social construct, meaning this is not an organic self-identity. So it now encompasses all of the various indigenous people groups from the Pacific Islands, not just Hawaiians and Samoans, but there's actually more than that. It also includes East Asians, so Pacific Rim people groups like the Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese. It includes Southeast Asia, so Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Hmongs, and then it includes South Asians now. This is probably where a lot of the misunderstanding often is even within the AAPI community, there is let me put it this way. If you were to just grab a random Asian person off the street and ask them, how do you identify? I guarantee you, if you grab 10, 9 of them would never mention Asian American. They would say, I'm Korean American, I'm Chinese American, I'm Taiwanese American. I'm, and even within South Asia, the sheer number of people groups, languages, and distinct ethnicities is often misunderstood. So there's this, we tend to flatten other nations and continental regions into, so example, we just say someone's from Africa. Right. And we never really get into like they're Ghanaian or they're from Congo. And same thing with India. Like we see it as this monolithic group, but there's so many. There's Tamil, there's Bengali, there's Hindu groups. So even even when you meet like someone from India, you have to really kind of dig down and ask where they're from, what state, what language do they speak. You can't assume. And so I think this is why AAPI, even within the Asian American community, is sometimes seen as an odd moniker or an odd identity to lean into. So internally, so this is really, it was born in the 60s. It was more of a social political movement. And it was really adjacent to the civil rights movement and the rise of Black Power identity. So there were just seminal like activists like Yuri Kochiyama who wanted to come alongside kind of like Black liberation ideas and bring the Asian Americans into that. But they knew that Asian Americans by a block are just such a small percentage they wanted to maximize. So let's be Asian American rather than Korean or Chinese or Indian. So that's a little bit on why it's an interesting identifier.
Yeah.
It's very complex.
That racial category, as Sam said, it's a social construct. It was created by the federal government to be used in the census. And so that's kind of where it came from. And so in some ways it's really arbitrary because, I mean, there's at least 20, it's probably more than that, countries when you look at that umbrella term. And in some ways there's commonality in those amongst those ethnicities, amongst those cultures, in the sense that they are often seen as outsiders because they're immigrants to this country. There is racism and discrimination that they face. That there is a sense of that term can be unifying, and yet, as you mentioned, it does diminish. Each of those ethnicities is so unique and so distinct that it diminishes the diversity of those cultures. And I think that's the thing, you talk about flattening. I think that's so true, that you put everybody into this one group and you're all the same. When, I mean, specifically, like even as you said, you could be Indian and it is so different whether I'm South Indian, so I'm from Kerala, my parents are from Kerala, and that is very different than if you're Gujarati, if you're from North India. We eat different food, we speak a different language, different clothing, all of it. Even there's just practices that are different. And that's in one country. So then you take Indians and Koreans or, Samoans, and it's so diverse that in a sense we lose some of that beauty when we put everyone in this one category.
Yeah. There's also a internal tension when you start talking to the individual ethnic and national groups. So, for example, Koreans and Japanese and Chinese have a long history that's very fraught. We may be seen as kind of like all East Asian. We probably look the most similar within like the Asian American group, but we like Koreans and Chinese were under Japanese imperial rule. Yeah. And so there is still a historical resentment that often will kind of play into the way even a current Korean person sees a Japanese person and vice versa. There's a lot of inherent racism within the Asian American sphere in the sense that the Chinese and the Japanese have always vied for this title of like alpha culture, and they often will see all the other Asian groups as inferior. So one of the reasons the Japanese had no qualms about having imperial ambitions in the rest of Asia was because they just simply saw Koreans as just inferior mongrels, and the Chinese as they're a powerful nation, but we're superior. other. And then you have like even the intramural tensions between mainland Chinese people and like Hong Kong people from Hong Kong and then people from Taiwan. A lot of people don't realize that the Taiwanese are actually an island people group, Formosans. And even though they've intermingled with mainland Chinese for a long time, there's still two ethnic groups that are in play there. And so there's a lot of political tension. So even those things sometimes are just not appreciated. And so when a Westerner kind of talks to someone from India or Vietnam or Korea, and they pick up on, oh, so you don't really see those people as like your people. I'm like, yeah, there's a reason. Like those people like colonized my people.
Right.
And like, so anyway, those are the type of things too that often get lost in the Western attempt to simplify racial categories.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say, because you reminded me that even that colonization adds a whole other layer into that.
That's
so
right.
between Indians and Pakistanis, because of colonization, because of political and even religious and ethnic tensions, they
right.
had often seen themselves as enemies.
Yep.
And so there's just all these complexities, even in the term AAPI.
Yeah, but even our younger generations are starting to kind of gray out some of those
Yes.
tensions. So example, if you ever see an Indo-Pak grocery store, that's an oddity outside of America.
Right.
Because you're going, oh, those people normally hate each other.
Right.
But here it's like you kind of have to band together.
Yeah.
And so like my kids' generation, they don't see the Japanese Americans in the same way. So I'll get one concrete example would be how so many current Asian Americans will now really speak out, especially among Gen Z, about Japanese internment. Whereas my parents' generation would have said, well, good for them. Like, that's what they deserved, And so it's even generational gaps that are forming in terms of self-identity. Yeah. And so my children, being second-generation Korean Americans, are much more apt to see other Asian Americans as part of their in-group. Whereas my parents, so within two generations, you're
How
seeing
different
these
that
major
is.
changes.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, May is obviously AAPI month, and one of the 5 facts about this month that I was looking at is that lawmakers chose May because of its historical significance for the AAPI community. It commemorates the immigration of the first Japanese people to the United States, as well as the Golden Spike Day on May 10th, 1869. Then the last point on here is kind of what Sam was talking about. Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month was able to exist due to the traction from the civil rights movement in the 70s. They were able to find momentum because of Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month. Let's shift to the church in particular for a second. I know this question could be a little harder because it's such a broad community, but is there distinctives of the Asian American church?
Yeah, I mean, a couple, again, as we said, this is really broad. So I think I speak to it more from the Indian church because that's my ethnicity and that's the church I grew up in. But I think there's a lot of commonalities, especially with Korean churches and Chinese churches. And so I don't want to be too broad in casting, hey, here's some distinctives. But I think in some ways this is really true. So one thing I would say is because Asian Americans often come from countries where Christianity is not the dominant faith, they're really passionate about their faith. They've often been the minority in their countries of origin, and so they come here and they will stand for their faith. It's such a vital part of their identity. There's good things and bad things about that, but because it oftentimes can get mixed with culture, and so that's where I say there are some negative things. But it's the thing that sets them apart, and so it's really significant to them. And then when so many of them come here as immigrants, one of the very first things they'll do, they'll find jobs and then they'll start a church. Yeah. All right? They'll find like-minded believers that are from the same ethnicity as they are, and they will start a church. It could be 5 families, 10 families, and they're starting a church because that sense it's such a communal culture. Yep. And that sense of community is so significant to them that they're in this foreign land. Everything's new to them. This is going to be their family. I grew up my parents are founding members of the church that I grew up in. And when they first started, there were 13 families. And now it's one of the biggest churches in their denomination, and it's still like 65, 70 families. It's not that big. But it was so significant to us because those people became our family, because we're all new here. You don't have those kind of community connections, so they had to create that. And that is just a really important part of how they do church, how they think of that place of belonging. I think ethnic churches are really important, particularly to immigrants, but we see this in the Black church as well, where they are beacons of hope and strength, and they're a refuge for them. Yeah. I remember, and my parents still say this, growing up, they're both passionate followers of Jesus, and they would say, here's why we love our church, why this is such a central part of our family and our way of life, is because Monday through Friday, I have to speak English, but Wednesday night and Saturday and Sunday, when they'd spend almost all day in church, they get to sing and to worship in their primary language, in their heart language. And they get to worship in ways that are culturally relevant to them. And that's really significant for immigrants in particular. So I think that sense of belonging, that opportunity to gather together as a community is really important. I think the other thing, and I know this to be true about the Korean and the Chinese church, but I see this in the Indian church, and it's something I really admire, is how they value prayer. Again, I think that comes from being that minority faith, that they really believe that God listens to the prayers of his people. I mean, it's such an important part of how they practice spiritual rhythms. And so they're going to gather together just for times of prayer. And they're going to intercede for each other. When someone's sick, not only are they bringing food, but they're praying for you. They're in your house. They're gathering together. They're lamenting. They're crying out to God. And that's always just really encouraged me, because I don't think I practice that rhythm the way my parents have and still do. And then related to that, the other thing I think that is distinctive is because they're immigrants and they have such value for what God is doing in their lives, they testify to that. Like and I think this is true in the Black church too, and I know my Korean friends experienced this, where part of a service, whether that's Saturday night or Wednesday night, was we're going to have testimony time, and I'm going to tell you this week how God has showed up for me. Like just this week, here's what God did. And that encourages people, you know. So I think there are these ways that they practice. The way that they're formed is through prayer, is through just acknowledging God's goodness, and through this understanding of this community is the core of who I am. Being with other followers of Jesus, this makes a difference in how I'm pursuing God.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to second just everything Sissy just said. And I think that another, like an underlying current in all of that, is that I just think Eastern cultures are communal, and they are not, so they're not individualized the same way like European cultures tend to be. Yeah. They're honor-shame cultures in various ways. And then they also have a very kind of global, spherical way of thinking rather than linear. Yes. So for them, it's all about big picture. It's all about this all fits together. Whereas like kind of a Eurocentric culture tends to kind of look at things in light of, well, how does A affect B and B affect C? And those things all kind of, you can see that in the way worship looks, and like you said, just the testimony aspect. One of the things that's kind of gained attention is the Korean practice of communal prayer. It's called Tongsonggido, and it's this wonderful moment where for someone who's never seen it, it's kind of disorienting, because all of a sudden the congregation just starts praying. It's not popcorn prayer. So that's very European. It's like linear. It's like you pray, then someone else pops up and prays. No, the Koreans just break out, and it just sounds like a roar as people are just crying out. And sometimes you hear some people they just don't have the words, and so the groans just come out as they just keep just repeating over and over again, Lord, Lord, Lord. And you know, there's stories of Korean retreats where people will just go out into the woods and like just grab a tree, and they'll just like pray all night, and like I'm gonna shake this oak tree, you know. So there's all these stories, but it's kind of born out of what you said. There's this intense belief in the power of prayer that's kind of culturally situated.
Yeah.
Some of that too is you have to explore like how there's a little bit of syncretism, bringing in
Yes.
our previous religious,
Yep.
frameworks, and then melding that with the Christian faith that we're learning. I think another thing that Sissy touched on, it's really important to understand, is why immigrant churches are so much more than spiritual institutions. They're actually community, social, political, civic institutions. So my dad was a pastor, and I remember there were days when he would go out, and I'm like, oh, what are you doing? And he says, I'm actually going to a court today because I'm going to go serve as a translator for a family because they just need someone. And when a Korean family who's just immigrated needs help, they don't go to like a civic service because early in the days of immigration, there just wasn't. And so the most natural thing was go to the church.
Yeah.
Do you have someone here? And it might be an elder or deacon who's like got a little more experience. And sometimes it'd be my dad, just as the pastor, being called to, hey, can you come and help us with this document? Or can you come to the court? And so that's why, like a Korean, and I'm sure this is the case for a lot of the ethnic immigrant churches, the services are just a part of the day. You're there all day. The meal is assumed.
Yeah.
It's not, do you want to stay for lunch? Oh, we're doing
it.
lunch.
Yeah,
And it's going to be this great spread of just native ethnic foods. And it's because for all these Korean immigrants, that was their place. Because like you said, during the week, they're the foreigners in American culture. And during those pockets of time at the church, they could just be themselves. And they can go, we know kimchi smells bad, but man, here we can just freely serve it. And we don't have to worry about like white people judging our food.
Right,
and so
right.
there was something and so I saw this in an interesting way as a second generation kid growing up. When I got to college, so I grew up, graduated from college or high school here. Then I went up to Wisconsin for undergrad and Michigan for grad school, and I just ran into Korean students from all over the country, Korean American. And it was stunning to me how much we understood in common. So I'm sitting with kids from Chicago, New York, LA, and yet we would just start joking about, did you guys do this?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, we did that. You guys did that too?
Right.
Down to the music we listened to and the way we dressed, there was just something, and it was so fascinating how national that was, even though we were detached communities, but there was just something about that was really, for me, a really important part of my growth because I grew up really just wanting to assimilate.
Yeah.
I just kind of had that, I know I'm Korean, but really what I took pride in was when my Americanized friends would say things like, hey, we don't see you as Asian. Like, we don't see you as Korean. Or they would say things like, you're one of the good ones. And what they meant by that was, you're not one of those quote unquote Oriental kids who has an accent.
Yeah.
You talk about the things we like, you dress like we do, you get the jokes we make. And so I used to take pride in that. And then as I got older, went into that college years and started to bond with people and realized, man, my Korean culture has so much that I shouldn't have taken for granted. And so I kind of swung the other way and started to really kind of get into the whole Korean identity. And what I realized later that helped kind of make sense of that was, oh, I'm third culture. Because when I go to Korea, it doesn't take but 3 seconds for people to see me walk out of the airport and go, he's not Korean. He's Korean American.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of even then a disdain among some of the Korean folks because he left here and he's not one of us anymore. But here, I'm always a perpetual foreigner.
Yeah.
I still get people say, doesn't matter what your paper says, you'll never be American. And so I've always been in this third space, and I never knew how to make sense of that until later in life. I just became really comfortable in my third culture skin, and I realized, no apologies. There's things about my Koreanness that I'm always going to embrace and love, but there's also things about my Americanness that I really value. So I think the Korean church, like so many Asian American churches, the reason people are a little surprised, like, hey, you guys speak English really well. Why are you still there? I think what a lot of folks on the outside don't realize is we may speak English fluently, but there are still aspects of our cultural identity that don't always get ministered to or healed or addressed in majority culture churches. And so that's why I think there's still this sort of magnetic draw for Asian Americans to still want to gather together, because that's where certain like scratches or itches get scratched.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me, I mean, I even just think of myself as someone that was born and raised here, who I can move really well between those two cultures. There's still something when I go back to my Indian church that there are ways that I can be there that I can't be anywhere else. Right. And there's things I now value even more about that I didn't value when I was a teenager, or not recognizing who I was allowed to be in that space, and just the beauty of some of the ways they practice their faith.
Asian hate in our world today. I obviously asked this question coming from a privileged white male of, it feels like, and tell me if I'm wrong, it feels like Asian hate has increased over the past handful of years. Is that accurate, or is it just the fact that, hey, you're just seeing it in the news more, or Isaac, you're white, you don't see it all the time?
I think it's yes and no. I do think there's more, but I also think it's just that our media has become more attuned to reporting it. So I think in the past, it was either covered up completely, it's just not seen as consequential, or it was kind of lumped in with all forms of racism. But I think what I'm appreciating today is there's a savviness now about how racialized hate manifests differently towards different groups. So, for example, the Black community endures some of the ugliest, what I would call overt kind of manifestations of hate, meaning they just come right out, and the tropes are just simply, you're not human, you're less than human, you're savage, you're just inferior. So anti-Asian racism is very subtle, because then that's why they use the term microaggressions. And so in that sense, I don't think it's really changed. I think that's always been there, so we're just reporting it better. What I do think has increased, though, the yes part to that answer is, I do think the overt incidents of violent acts against Asian American people, that has increased. And I do think there are a couple of factors there. I do think the pandemic plays into that. I think the other thing is if you walk around some of the suburbs across America, there is a more visual representation of Asian population. So, for example, here in Dallas, I would say it's like from Irving to Carrollton to Plano, there's this belt. And if you're in that belt, everywhere you go, you get the impression that Asian Americans or Asian immigrants are now like at least half the population. It's not accurate, but that's the feeling. And I think that demographic shift in a short time, that churn is very disruptive. So I think that has brought on a little bit more of a response of hate crimes, of, man, they're taking over. And I think there's a feeling of feeling threatened by that presence that has led to more overt, So I think it's yes and no. I think we're growing in our ability to identify microaggressions, racist tropes. We're getting better, like finally understanding that the model minority myth is damaging, not good. Understanding how Asian Americans are often used as a wedge group to actually harm other Black and brown communities, things like that. So, but I do think that because of the pandemic and because of demographic churn, the more overt incidents have also increased.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there is some increase. I think along with that, similar to what you're saying, Sam, I think for so long, racism and discrimination against Asian Americans has been minimized, or in fact ignored in many ways. And I think that's related to like the invisibility of anti-Asian racism is directly correlated to the invisibility of Asian Americans in the American culture.
Totally
right? So
agree, yeah.
this stat I read was 58% of Americans can't name a single prominent Asian American. 42% can't think of a historical experience or policy related to Asian Americans. And then in many ways, Asian Americans have contributed to that because we often minimize discrimination and that we've experienced, and so therefore it goes unreported. So I think it's both. I wonder, though, whether that increase is as large as we think it is, or whether it's just been minimized, ignored, or just underreported.
And even Sam, if you're willing to dive into, we had dinner a few weeks ago, and you were telling some stories about your time in Russia, and just that, since you're talking about being minimized, or I think sometimes people might not, especially white people, might not think of stories or stuff that you have went through. And as a missionary in Russia, would you share one of those stories?
Sure. And this will be illustrative, I guess, of just how anti-Asian racism is not a uniquely American thing. It really is more of a white versus Asian kind of dynamic. So my family and I lived in Russia for a few years doing student ministry, and it was a wonderful experience overall. So I want to make sure I put that out there first. But our team leader and our it was a white family, and so their reception, they got there before we did, and they were laying the groundwork for establishing a place for our ministry and everything. And so when they brought us over, the general word was, man, they love us here. They love having us here. This was not one of the flagship cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. So they were experiencing this kind of wonderful invitation from the people of this city because the Americans being there was a novelty. So every time my friend would go to a school to ask about their kids going there, they just be like, oh my gosh, we'd love to have American students in our school. And so when we got there, we started noticing that the student ministry, we'd go to like a cafe, invite these Russian students to come out, and they would just flock to all the white members of the missions team. And my wife and I, Hannah and I, would just kind of be sitting there, and we'd be sitting at a table by ourselves. And our team leaders were just like, I don't know what's going on. And then eventually I got to a point where I could speak Russian, and that definitely eased some things. But even then, we were always kind of at the corner of the room and kind of ignored to a degree. And then I started to notice that even at the street level, there was just this hostility towards me that I didn't see towards anyone else on our team. So this was not an American thing.
Yeah.
So I'll give one example. Was I went to a store to look for a gift for a friend, and so I walk in, and the little lady who's running that counter just ignored me. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Finally, I just walked up. I said, excuse me, can I get some help? And she just said, we don't serve people like you here. And I'm just like, oh, and so by now I'm speaking Russian, so I asked in very polite Russian, I'm sorry, what did I do to offend you, and what do you mean by your people? And she goes, we don't serve Chinese people here. And I go, I'm not Chinese, I'm actually American, but I'm from Korea. And her face flipped in a second. And all of a sudden, she was just like, can I help? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
What are you looking for? And what I started to learn was that there is an intense fear/hate towards the Chinese and Vietnamese immigrants who would often make it into Russia. And to them, it was very much analogous to the way a lot of Americans here fear the immigrants coming from the South. So Vietnamese immigrants were seen as kind of the same way like Mexican immigrants are often seen here. They're a drag on our economy. They're outsiders. All they bring is crime and pollution, that type of thing. And I realized that's what they think I am. And so I was actually stopped by cops several times, thinking I might be dealing drugs or things. And really, probably the worst incident was, one night I was just walking home, and it wasn't even like super late at night, but then like a group of like 5 or 6 guys jumped me and just started beating me up. And they did take a few things, but it really, it wasn't really, that wasn't their main purpose. Wow. They were kind of drunk. They see this Asian guy by himself, and they just decide, you know what? He doesn't belong here. Let's just beat the crap out of him. And what
Sam's not telling you is those 5 guys ended up in the hospital. Sam Wan,
I wish, but that's just, But what was really interesting wasn't so much that, because I'd experienced racism like that even in the States.
Sure. Yeah.
What was really interesting was the struggle our teammates had.
Yeah.
Because they...
To understand that?
Yes. They were so shocked by what was happening.
Right.
And they were like, man, they love us here. And I finally had to just kind of sit them down just to look, you're white.
Yeah.
And even over here, that is how the world is kind of divided up.
Yeah.
And so it was a really sobering lesson for our team leader and his family and just some of the members of our team. And then from the Russian side, I just want to add real quick that the students in our ministry, the Russian national staff, they couldn't have been more wonderful. I mean, they were visiting me, and after that happened, like I'd have students who'd just say, hey, when you go home tonight after this event, I'm going to walk home with you. I mean, you don't have to do that. No, I'm going to. And they would all just say things like, please don't think that's us. We love that you came here. We're so thankful you did. And so it really was just, I don't want to make it seem like our time there was horrible, but we realized that, this is not just an American thing. Yeah, that these dynamics are really kind of a global struggle between kind of this concept of white supremacy. Yeah. And this is why like white supremacist groups have gained so much traction in Russia in these last 20 years. So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. I'm sorry that, especially not knowing that was what you were going to experience, I think is even more, right? Like you weren't aware.
No, I definitely wasn't on my bingo card.
Yeah.
But it was, it's one of those things though, it's a lesson that you learn about life that, it was really a great moment of deepening faith. Yeah. Just really having to lean on God and,
What would you say are ways that the American church, or even the white majority culture church, can speak to the pains of the Asian American community, the pains and frustration? How can we do that effectively as a church?
So one really simple thing is learn our names. It's like just try to learn our names, pronounce them the way we pronounce them, and don't just say, well, we're going to call you Bob now, because that's easier for us. That's highly offensive. Like, learn our names. Just like we learn your names, you learn our names. Learn our stories. Don't group us all into one category. I often see, and this happens with Indians and Pakistanis, it happens with Koreans and Chinese, like, you're all the same. Yeah. We're not. There's so many unique, distinct, beautiful things about each one of those cultures. Take the time to learn our stories. And then I think what's so important for each of us to do is to, as you're learning our stories, what can you learn from our cultures that will inform how you better understand God? There are things that I learned from you, Isaac, that I learned from Sam, that are that God has put you in my life so that I might know Him in a different way that I by myself cannot do. And so we need one another. What if we began trying to understand each other, including our cultures, so that we might better understand God?
Man, that's great. Yeah. So I would frame it this way. I think that one of the hardest things for primarily white churches and institutions who aspire to true multiculturalism is that they have a really difficult time escaping the gravitational pull of colonial kind of frameworks.
That's good. Yeah.
And so you may have the best intentions for how you relate to me, but there is this latent layer that most leadership will struggle to escape, and that is we are here to teach these
Mm-hmm.
foreign people who are kind of below us in the faith, and we're going to bring them along.
That's right.
And that's kind of the ugly side of kind of the world missions, modern missions movement, is that it placed the Eurocentric cultural church in the place of kind of teacher and purveyor of
Right.
faith.
It's the model, yeah.
And then what that did unintentionally was it placed all these other global forms of Christianity in kind of a subservient position. And so even in the most like well-meaning settings, I still see the traces of that come through sometimes. And the other thing is exactly what Sissy said. Instead of seeing people like us as, oh, we need to support them and teach them and bring them along, I would just say, yeah, actually maybe we were all supposed to be part of one giant whole. So I use this kind of framework. I basically say that multicultural diversity is ultimately doxological. So if I'm going to put this theologically, here's what I mean. One thing I've learned over the years being third culture, being Korean American, being Asian American, and then having the privilege of having lived in Russia is every culture has its own unique strengths when it comes to being able to reflect the realities and the beauties of creation. So here's a great way, because I kind of work in the field of languages. I'm fascinated when one culture has a word or a phrase that I have trouble translating into another. And what I realize is, oh, that culture has a way of seeing this phenomenon that this culture is kind of blind to or
Right.
a little bit unaware of. And so they've come up with ways to express that.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful way of
Yeah.
doing it. And then vice versa. So when you look at that Revelation picture that people love to cite of people from every tribe, nation, and tongue, so a lot of, I think, primarily white believers see that really more in a kind of romanticized sense, that it'll be nice when we're finally kind of like this. I see it as theologically necessary. Here's why. If even one family is missing from that assembly, we lose doxological language. That means there's going to be a way of seeing God that was unique to
Yep.
that tribe, that culture, that language that's missing.
good.
So this is why I think Jesus' mission was always to bring all the families together at the end, so that when we worship together, there's going to be German words that are going to hit on something about God that no one else can quite get. There are going to be like various Indian and Korean and Chinese conceptions that will just add to the language of worship that no one else can contribute. And that's why I think shifting your view from a romantic, it would be very nice view of cultural diversity to, no, this is actually theologically necessary.
Yeah, that's
Really will kind of help people kind of just realize, oh, this is more important than I realized.
Yeah.
I had a question about resources, but I think for time's sake, I think it would be better if we, if you check the description of the podcast, I think we'll drop some links to some resources from the both of you that would be awesome. My last question before we do some fun banter real quick, how can listeners be praying for the AAPI community right now?
I think pray for Asian American churches. Again, as we mentioned earlier, they really are beacons of strength and hope and refuges for immigrants. So I think there's a vital place for them in American culture. I think secondly, pray for Asian Americans that are, stepping into majority culture churches. One of the things that we try to be really mindful of here at IBC is we want people to come here that are from different ethnicities and backgrounds and experiences, but we don't want you to come here so that you do things our way. We want you to come here so that together we can do something. We want to be different because you're here. We're going to do things differently because you're here, and that's really important to us. But part of being able to do things differently because you're here is for us to understand who you are and what you bring, and for people to feel like they're seen and known and valued here for who they are. So I think pray for Asian American that are stepping into majority culture churches, pray for those churches that they would embrace people like that, all people. And then I think thirdly, this isn't necessarily Asian Americans, but I think there's something here to pray for the global church, that now more than ever, churches all over Asia and the Pacific Islands, particularly in Asia, when you think of China and India and Pakistan and so many other places where they are a persecuted minority, that they are experiencing a level of persecution that I have no concept of. And so just praying for those churches that they would be able to stand firm for their faith and be encouraged in the Lord.
Yeah, that's a great list. I might just kind of lean a little bit more into the specific one of, excuse me, praying for the Asian American churches. So one of the conversations I remember having in seminary 20 years ago was, are they going to disappear? Because as my generation comes to maturity, I am culturally fluent in American. I speak American. I can code switch on a dime, and I'm pretty comfortable. Like it's not that I'm artificially entering American culture. It's what I grew up in.
Right.
But what I started to realize, it took me some years and some maturing, is that when I'm in primarily majority culture spaces, not just churches, but institutions, workplaces, there's a part of me that's sort of shriveling.
Yeah.
If I don't stay in touch with my Korean roots, friends, community. So even though I think you're going to continue to see churches like IBC and others draw in more and more Asian Americans, I've also seen like a kind of a quiet exodus at times. So one of the phenomena I've observed is you will see like a Korean American person just jump right into like kind of a primarily white church because they love maybe the pastor's well known or it's a big church. And then something funny happens. Right around the time they start having kids, they slowly leave those churches quietly. And what I started to realize is when you're single and it's just you can code switch and assimilate and you're great. The minute you start having children and kind of trying to assimilate as a family, you start to realize, oh, after all this time, we're still kind of outsiders.
Right.
And it's not until your kids come home and say, I was at Sunday school and these kids made fun of me. Or I was at youth group and they don't really invite me to anything. And then they say, you know what? Let's go back to that Korean church because our friends are there. And so I would just say pray for those Asian American churches because they still serve a purpose. Because sometimes it's not, and I'm not saying this as a demeaning comment or a critical comment, I'm just really kind of describing the reality is that not all primarily white churches who aspire to multiculturalism are always ready to minister well to and this goes for like Black community, Hispanic, Latino as well. And so there's still a place for those churches, as Sissy said. So I would say that's a great place to just say, how do we partner with them? Instead of saying, why are you even here? I think a better conversation is, hey, we're both doing something for the Lord in different spaces, and we're both ministering and meeting needs in different ways, and we need each other. So I think that'd be a real healthy way to view one another.
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you for this conversation. I mean, this was awesome. It was a great conversation, and really appreciate Sam. Thank you so much. Sam, each week we transition at the very end for a few minutes to have some fun.
You're on the hot seat, Sam.
You're on the hot seat now. We have debated fast food fries. We have talked about Sissy loving Peeps. Sam, do you like Peeps?
That's not what this is about, Isaac.
I will have, so when they make their appearance, I will all of a sudden crave them.
Oh my gosh.
And then I'll have one, 2, and then I'm like,
done.
Why did I want them? So
you're like, this is trash.
It's a love-hate. It's like, but then I don't have one for a year.
You don't have to.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I'm just like, oh man, I gotta buy a pack.
It's Peeps time. Yeah.
Okay, so
Happens to the
summer
best of us.
Summer is coming. And summer is referred to by some people as wedding season. You know, a lot of people like to get married over the summer, spring, early fall. So we need some help. How do you survive wedding season? If somebody's listening to this and like, hey, I have like 3 weddings I'm going to this summer. I got to get through this. I found this article. I had 6 reasons. I'm going to list the 6 reasons. I'm going to list the 6 ways that this article put out there to survive wedding season. And you guys chime in if it's yay or nay.
Okay.
They said eat beforehand. They said choose the right outfit. Buy comfortable shoes. Respect the couple's wishes. Have fun, but remember the photographer. That was basically like, have fun, but
Watch
it's
yourself,
not
yeah.
all about you. And then when all else fails, buy a gift. So my question off the top, when you are picking a closeout for a wedding, are you going for style or comfort?
Well, like, so I do a lot of Indian weddings, so it's definitely style. But you got to like factor in, you're going to be on that dance floor for a while, so you got to take that into account. Think about your shoes. I mean, by the end of the night, I'm usually barefoot anyway, so like, it's not
Whoa!
gonna- just got to go with it. You're going to be dancing all night.
Dang. Everybody invites Sissy to your weddings.
I would say one of the greatest advances in human history is that we are finally starting to accept kind of dress casual.
Well, let's
And
go.
so all of a sudden, it is okay to wear stretchy pants. You can wear like hybrid dress sneakers.
Yeah.
And so we are getting to enjoy things in
Yeah.
terms of our sartorial things that our grandparents would have like killed for. So I would just say absolutely dress comfortably.
Yeah.
But today, if you do it smart, you don't have to sacrifice the
Style.
style.
That's
Yeah.
good. What would y'all add to that list? What would you tell somebody to survive wedding season?
This is my biggest tip for weddings.
Uh-oh.
All right. This is
She's
my
got this
biggest tip.
ready.
Oh, I do. I have like weddings. I've been to so many weddings. I got a couple this summer too. So here's I think this is my number 1 tip. Eat at the cocktail hour because you don't know what dinner is going to be.
Oh, that's
So
good.
like, don't pace. Eat at the cocktail hour because you have no idea what's going to happen at dinner. I go to really big weddings because Indian weddings are a couple hundred at a minimum usually.
Yeah.
And so you never know what's going to happen. You're going to be there all night. Got to figure it out. So
So the cocktail hour, you're
Yeah,
not
so
even
if-
talking about hitting up like a drive-through on the way.
no, I don't know. I'm going to this wedding. I want to.
Yeah.
So a big thing for Indian weddings is like how they serve food says how much they respect their guests.
Right.
And it's not just food, it's drink too. Like you have to have the best food, the best drink. That says a lot about my respect for your guests. So if you don't have good food, kind of says I didn't really care about you that much. Again, it's this communal culture. So you know you're going to get something good. You just don't know, like, is it the cocktail hour that's going to be really good? Because they'll have like 6 or 7 stations and all this kind of stuff. And
Yep.
hand pass hors d'oeuvres and all of that. So anyway, I always say like,
Yeah.
think ahead.
Good tip there. I would say, I know we're speaking to a wide range of folks in the Christian sphere. But if you are at weddings with cash bars,
This is good.
just know that the bartenders and the wait staff are working really hard and they're human. So I always bring extra cash
Tip well,
because
yeah.
if you tip well, each time you go up for another drink,
They're going to take care of you.
they take care of you. They don't skimp as much. They're more willing to pour you a little extra of the good stuff and things like that. So if you get like a Jack and Coke, they don't give you mostly Coke with
Yeah.
just a little dab of Jack.
Yeah.
And so if you tip well, the next time you get a little more Jack and Coke. So it's just
That's a good tip, Sam.
This is
Yeah.
good. This is good
Yeah.
stuff. The last wedding I was at was Caroline's wedding, and they had, when you walked in, they had a boba tea wall.
oh
And it was
That's
like, that was
nice.
kind of like I don't know, Carolyn, is that the cocktail hour kind of, before while the picture's being taken, you just go and grab your boba tea off the wall. And it was,
multiculturalism.
yeah, it was
That's
so,
awesome.
it was so cool. Okay. Yeah, I think the comfortable shoes part, I don't take my shoes off at weddings, but I guess Sissy
I do.
does. Both dance floor people?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, let's go.
Hannah loves dancing, and since we're now at a point where we really don't get out to the club, weddings she really looks forward to them.
At this point.
Yeah, because, yeah.
This is her opportunity, right?
Yeah,
so that's
So
good.
you and Hannah had a club phase?
Yes, we did. But hey, we're running out of time, aren't we?
That's another episode.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to hop off here and talk about Sam and Hannah's club phase. But thank you so much for listening today, and share this episode with a friend this week, especially because it is AAPI Month and the month of May. Thanks again, Sam. Hopefully, we'll see you soon.